Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to 12th century England, a world of cold stone churches, muddy village roads, and more than a few chickens running freely across them. The air smells faintly of wet wool, smoke, and damp straw, and the seasons roll in not with weather alerts, but with the ringing of bells and the silence of fields. You open your eyes not in a castle, not in a cloister, but in a thatched-roof cottage tucked beside a barley field. Congratulations, you're a girl. And whether you like it or not, that single fact already determines the path your life will most likely follow. From your name to your neighbors, from your shoes, if you ever own any, to your future husband, whom you will definitely not get to choose, every major turn in your story has already been penciled in. With heavy hands. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching from somewhere cozy, let me know in the comments, where are you in the world, and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born in winter, which sounds poetic but mostly means you'll grow up with chilblains and never quite feel warm again. Your mother wraps you in linen rags and maybe whispers a prayer, perhaps to Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth. She knows what kind of life awaits you, and if she looks away quickly, it's not from lack of love. It's from knowing too much. From the start, your very body is classified. You'll never be considered a full legal person, not in the way your father or brother is. You're someone's daughter, and one day, someone's wife. You belong to a male lineage like a spoon belongs to a kitchen drawer. Even before you can walk, your presence is already subject to what medieval legal documents call wardship, which is not as cute as it sounds. It means if your father dies before you come of age, the local lord gets to decide who raises you, and who gets your dowry. Spoiler, it's rarely you. By the time you're 4 or 5, you're helping gather herbs or chase geese out of the vegetable garden. If you were born into a noble household, maybe you're learning embroidery and how to curtsy without toppling over. If you're a peasant girl, your skills are a little more earthy, carrying water, feeding pigs, watching younger siblings, and keeping your mouth shut when men talk. That last one. Vital for survival. School is not an option for you, unless you're nobility or destined for the nunnery. For the vast majority of girls, learning to read is considered unnecessary, if not dangerous. What would a girl even need books for? Better to put a spindle in her hands than a scroll, say the men writing the rules. And that's not just metaphorical. Laws in many places explicitly prohibit women from accessing formal education unless they're cloistered nuns or born into families eccentric enough to care. Historians still argue whether these early limitations were based more on religious control or pure social inertia. Either way, you won't be joining the great universities springing up in Paris, Bologna, or Oxford, not unless you're sneaking in under a robe and a fake mustache, which, while entertaining to imagine, would get you swiftly tossed out by a monk with a broom. You're also not allowed to testify in most courts. Not because you're unintelligent, but because the law simply doesn't view you as reliable. There's a general belief that women are ruled by emotion, easily manipulated, and, this is real, too close to the lunar cycle to be trusted. You might be able to swear an oath in a church court, but good luck getting anyone to believe you over a male witness. And in some regions, your word counts for half of a man's. You are, legally speaking, one half of a credibility unit. But don't worry, your value will increase. Around age 12. That's when you become marriageable, a word that should come with a lightning strike and dramatic thunder. If you're lucky, your parents will wait until you're 15 or 16. If you're unlucky, your wedding will happen before you know how to spell it. You may think of marriage as a romantic milestone, but in your world, it's a transaction. A treaty. A transfer of ownership wrapped in silk ribbon and sealed with a church bell. You're the item. The dowry you bring, a cow, a plot of land, a bundle of linens, or maybe a few silver pennies, is more scrutinized than your opinion on the match. And here's the catch, once you're married, your legal existence collapses into your husband's. You're no longer allowed to make contracts, own property, or go to court without his permission. The law doesn't just erase your name, it grafts it onto his like ivy on a stone wall. You become the wife of, a beautiful phrase if you're in love, a suffocating one if you're not. Historians still debate how deeply this erasure was felt by women themselves. Did they resist in small, everyday acts, locking chests, hiding coins, whispering plans? Or did they accept the structure as natural law, passed down like a family recipe no one questions? The truth, probably, lies somewhere between. There are stories, whispered through time, of women who pushed back. One woman refuses a marriage and hides in a convent. Another poisons her cruel husband with berry wine. A third runs off with a troubadour and changes her name forever. But these are outliers, not expectations. Most girls grow up to become wives, then mothers, then widows. And even that final category, widowhood, comes with asterisks. You can't inherit everything. You may be pressured to remarry. You might be watched closely by male relatives who fear you'll suddenly develop opinions. Even your clothes announce your status. As a young girl, you wear loose tunics and your hair long and uncovered. But upon marriage, a veil or wimple is required, a kind of medieval status update. This woman has been claimed. Heaven forbid you wear the wrong color. Sumptuary laws may dictate what fabrics and dyes you're permitted to wear based on your class and marital status. Yes, even your closet is under surveillance. And yet, here's the curious part, while the world defines you legally as secondary, your daily role is absolutely central. You manage the household, rear the children, feed the family, often tend the garden, the chickens, the finances, and sometimes the village gossip. Without you, the entire medieval world would collapse under its own muddy boots. But the law will never say that out loud. Your hands are cracked. Your back aches from lifting pails. Your smile, if anyone asked, might be cautious but present. You're not without joy. You laugh sometimes. You watch birds fly overhead and think about other lives. You find peace in bread rising, in wool combed straight, in a secret you carry that no man knows. So here you are, born into powerlessness. Not because you're weak, but because the system demands it. And as the candlelight flickers low in your small room, and the sound of wind outside tickles the thatch above you, you wonder, not with bitterness, but with quiet, if anyone will ever write down your name. You learn the rules, no land, no legal voice, and barely an identity. You're older now. Maybe 14, maybe 16, it's hard to know exactly, since birthdays aren't often written down for girls like you. But your body tells the tale, stronger arms from grinding grain, calloused hands from scrubbing rushes, a back that twinges just enough to remind you that your life is built around bending, not standing tall. And somewhere between learning how to lace a bodice and how to bake bread evenly on a hearthstone, you also begin to understand something far less tangible: the law is not made for you. It's all around you, but it rarely speaks to you. Unless, of course, you break it. You can't read the law, it's written in Latin, or Norman French, or some naughty legal dialect no one in your village uses in daily speech. But you hear about it. From the steward. From your father. From the traveling friar who gives a sermon on obedience so pointed that even the chickens get nervous. The rules of the world seep in not through parchment, but through practice. The most important thing to know is this: as a woman, you are legally invisible. Not in the sense of being ignored, you're often the center of domestic labor, childbearing, even spiritual influence, but in that legal documents often do not recognize you as an individual with rights. Unless you're a widow or a nun, you exist in law primarily as an extension of a man. This is because of something quaintly terrifying called coverture. The moment you marry, your legal identity is covered by your husband's. You become a femme covert, a term that sounds like a spy but mostly means you can't own land, enter into contracts, or represent yourself in court. You can't sue. You can't be sued. And if your husband commits a crime and you were anywhere near him when he did it, you might be legally considered his accessory. Love truly is binding. But here's where things get twisty. Before you're married, as a femme sole, you do technically have legal standing. In theory, you can make contracts, appear in court, and even own property. But there's a catch. Or 6. Let's say your father dies and leaves you a little plot of land. You're 15 and unmarried. Theoretically, that land is yours. But wait, the local lord must approve. And your male guardian might manage it, on your behalf. And if you marry, guess what happens? That land slides into your husband's domain like a chicken slipping through a loose fence. Historians still argue whether women understood the full legal implications of marriage at the time. Some suggest that girls were taught early and clearly that land, dowries, and inheritance weren't just family matters, they were transactions. Others argue that many rural women didn't realize they were relinquishing control until the ink dried, or, more often, until someone else signed on their behalf. Then there's the issue of testimony. If you witness a crime, or worse, are the victim of one, your voice may not carry legal weight. In many courts across medieval Europe, women were considered unreliable witnesses. The prevailing belief was that women were too emotional, too easily swayed, or too physically fragile to withstand the rigors of cross-examination. A woman's testimony, when accepted at all, might be given half the weight of a man's. Literally. As in, 2 women might equal 1 man in court. This also played out in shocking ways. For example, if your husband beat you, and he might, because correction was considered a husband's duty, you could, in some jurisdictions, appeal to the local bishop or bailiff. But unless the abuse left visible wounds, or unless a male neighbor saw it and was willing to risk testifying, your case might be dismissed with a shrug and a sermon. After all, what is a husband if not the keeper of your soul and the occasional bruiser of your arms? Still, you learn the law in the same way you learn to milk a goat or mend a sock, by watching it applied. You hear stories. You listen to older women mutter about unfair divisions of inheritance, or how the reeve took their harvest and claimed it was short, even when it wasn't. You hear about the girl from the next village who tried to run away from her betrothal and was brought back by the sheriff, roped like a wayward cow and fined for dishonoring the arrangement. You learn what not to do. And what always happens when you try. But here's the strange part, the law isn't always one solid block. Sometimes it flickers, wavers, contradicts itself. You hear that in some towns, women can own businesses. That in a few trade guilds, widows inherit their husbands' shops and keep them running. That abbesses in distant convents control vast tracts of land and issue decrees with the authority of small kings. These stories come like fireflies, rare and flickering, but undeniably real. You begin to realize that the law is a fabric, not stone, woven tight for some, loosely stitched for others. Class, region, and marital status all determine how heavy the cloak of coverture really is. In the countryside, where people know each other's faces better than they know the king's laws, things can be more flexible. The miller's widow might lend grain and be repaid with favors. The herbalist might broker peace between feuding families without ever setting foot in a courthouse. These women operate in custom more than law, and sometimes, custom has a longer memory than parchment. But don't mistake this flexibility for freedom. One widow's success can spark envy, and the line between respected and which is perilously thin. A woman with too much knowledge, too much influence, or simply too much land, is often a short step away from being summoned for questioning, either by the manor court, or worse, by the church. Historians still debate whether these accusations stem from misogyny, fear, or genuine belief in magic. Likely, it was a potent stew of all three, stirred by local politics and poured into whichever cup happened to belong to an outspoken woman. And then, there's the curious case of laws about clothing. Yes, really. In certain regions, women were legally restricted from wearing certain colors, fabrics, or jewelry based on their social class. These sumptuary laws were designed to keep peasants looking poor and nobles looking rich, with little room in between. So if you, as a merchant's wife, happen to inherit a silk veil and wear it on market day, you might be fined for dressing above your station. And fined by a man wearing 5 different shades of velvet. So, what does the law say about you? It says, be quiet. Be obedient. Be invisible in legal matters, but indispensable in labor. It says that your property is his, your voice is optional, and your future is negotiable. So long as a man signs the papers. But what it doesn't say, what it never says, is how clever you are. How you remember numbers better than your husband. How you keep a separate stash of coins hidden in an old sock. How you learn the tone of the bailiff's voice when he's bluffing, and the twitch in the steward's brow when he's about to charge you extra. The law may not see you as fully human, but you navigate it like water through cracks in stone, slowly, persistently, shaping the path it claims to control. And when your daughter asks why she can't own the goat she feeds every morning, you smile, not with bitterness, but with a quiet resolve. Because someday, someone will write down everything the law forgot to mention. Getting married means losing your name, your rights, and even your spoon collection. The day arrives. Not the one with white lace and first dances, no, that's a few centuries and at least one industrial revolution away. Your wedding day is far less glamorous, and yet in the eyes of your village and the law, far more defining. It's the day you become someone's wife. Not a woman, not an individual, but a legal attachment, folded neatly beneath your husband's name like a forgotten napkin. There's a donkey braying somewhere, perhaps annoyed that your wedding procession is using the same muddy path it was hoping to nap on. Your dress is your best wool tunic, brushed clean for the occasion, and your hair has been braided carefully by your mother or sister, 2 long plaits that signal purity, which everyone notices with suspicious eagerness. The ceremony takes place in the parish church, because that's where all official marriages must be recorded. A priest presides, fumbling through Latin phrases while local boys snicker in the back pews. You repeat vows you didn't write, to a man you didn't choose, in front of a God you hope isn't too distracted by the chicken clucking beneath the altar. Once the words are said, and hands clasped, and the little wax seal is pressed onto the marriage register, that's it. You're married. The church smiles. The community nods. And the law. The law quietly removes you from the ledger of independent beings and files you under your husband's account. You may have come to the church as Marjorie, daughter of William, but you leave as wife of John, and that subtle change is monumental. You lose your maiden name. Your household allegiance. Your legal ability to make any decision on your own. You even lose ownership of your own dowry. Yes, that chest of linens, that silver brooch from your grandmother, and even the spoon you used to stir soup back at your father's hearth. All now belong to your husband. The law says so. It's called coverture, and if it had a slogan, it might be, what's yours is his, and what's his, is still his. Historians still argue how rigorously coverture was enforced in everyday life. Some say the law was more symbolic than practical, especially in rural areas where survival often required both spouses to contribute equally. Others point out that in cities and noble courts, the letter of the law was taken seriously, right down to contracts voided because the woman had no legal standing to sign. Let's say your husband dies and leaves you some land. You might think you finally got some breathing room. But unless the marriage contract included a jointure, a formal agreement granting you property rights, you might still be at the mercy of his male relatives. A brother-in-law with a pen can be more dangerous than a knight with a sword. There's also the dower. A customary third of your husband's estate set aside for you upon his death. But it's not guaranteed. It depends on local custom, on whether he arranged it properly, and whether the estate has debts. And even if you get it, you can't sell it. It's yours in name, but you only hold it as long as you remain a widow. Remarry, and poof, it's gone. Marriage giveth, and marriage taketh away. The law also dictates how you behave inside marriage. Your husband is allowed, sometimes even encouraged, to discipline you. Within reason, of course, but reason is a flexible concept. Some jurisdictions permitted men to beat their wives with a stick no thicker than their thumb. That's where we get the dubious phrase, rule of thumb. Though scholars still debate the historical accuracy of that specific claim, what's clear is that physical correction was not considered criminal unless it led to death or scandal. And scandal only mattered if it disrupted public peace, not your peace of mind. And let's not forget marital consent, or rather, the lack thereof. Under medieval canon law, a wife was expected to submit to her husband's conjugal rights. To say no was to defy not just your husband, but the divine order of the household. Your body was not truly yours anymore, it was part of the marriage package, like a cottage with a leaky roof, sold as is, with no warranty. So where do you go for help, if your husband drinks too much, beats too often, or simply makes your life unbearable? In most cases, nowhere. You might appeal to the church court, but unless you can prove impotence, incest, or abandonment, they'll likely urge you to reconcile and pray. Civil courts don't want to meddle in domestic matters. Even your family may hesitate to intervene. It's shameful to speak ill of your husband, and besides, dowries aren't refundable. There are whispers, of course, of women who resist. A miller's wife who locks her husband out of the house. A brewer's widow who takes over the alehouse and refuses all suitors. A noblewoman who writes poetry mocking her husband's snoring. But these are stories passed quietly from mouth to mouth, rarely written down. The scribes are men, and they prefer tales where order is maintained. Your daily life now revolves around your husband's name, his schedule, and his expectations. You cook his meals, clean his linens, raise his children, and carry water from the well that technically belongs to him, even if you've been hauling buckets from it since before you knew what marriage was. Sometimes, he lets you have your way. You manage the kitchen accounts. You choose which vegetables to plant. You even tell him to wear his nicer hose when the Lord's Reeve comes around. And in those moments, it almost feels like a partnership. Almost. But never forget, if it comes to it, his word outweighs yours, in the courts, in the town square, in the eyes of the priest, and even within your own family. You begin to understand that marriage is not just a personal relationship, it's a legal transfer, a reclassification, a merger in which one partner gets all the shares. You may love your husband. You may not. Either way, the law assumes your loyalty. It does not ask your opinion. And yet, you carve out space. You memorize your husband's moods. You build quiet routines that no one bothers to regulate. You save a pinch of salt here, a coin there. You whisper lessons to your daughters under your breath while kneading dough. You teach them how to smile without agreeing, how to sew while listening, how to survive the trap without stepping too loudly inside it. Because someday, your daughter too will stand in a cold church beside a man she didn't choose. And you want her to be ready, not just for the ceremony, but for everything the ceremony never says. Marriage, you now know, is not just a milestone. It is a gate. And once you pass through, the world changes its tone, its terms, and its expectations. But you're still here. And you're still listening. And perhaps, just perhaps, you're starting to whisper back. Everything you own becomes his, including your goat, your dowry, and your silence. You wake early, as usual. The hearth is cold, the floor colder. You pad across it with bare feet and quietly start the fire, nudging damp twigs into the embers with a practiced hand. There's flour to grind, stew to warm, linen to rinse, and chickens to chase from the cabbages again. All familiar. All yours, or at least, that's how it feels. But here's the curious truth, none of it is actually yours. The blanket over your shoulder? His. The milk jug you filled yesterday? His. The goat in the shed bleating for oats? Also his. Legally speaking, the very moment you stood beside your husband and said the medieval equivalent of, "I do," you disappeared into him like a drop of ink in a bucket of water. The doctrine of coverture didn't just mean your name folded beneath his, it meant every physical object, every coin, every scrap of food, every acre of land you brought with you. No matter how lovingly or laboriously earned, transferred entirely to his control. This included your dowry, which was not a gift to you, but an investment in him. Your father may have bargained for days over its terms. Perhaps it included a plot of land, or 2 cows, or a woven tapestry. It might even have included coinage, rare, but possible among merchant families. The dowry's purpose was to make you more attractive, as if you were a business deal wrapped in ribbon. And once you marry, every item listed becomes part of your husband's assets. You no longer have any legal right to it. You can't reclaim it. You can't even demand it back if he squanders it all on ale and gambling. Historians still argue about how strictly this rule was enforced in different regions. In some towns, women retained use rights, meaning they could physically use their dowry goods, even if they didn't legally own them. In wealthier circles, elaborate contracts might spell out exactly what could and couldn't be claimed. But for most women, the moment the church bells rang, the goat was his. Now let's say you brought a small chest of coins into the marriage, perhaps inherited from your mother, who squirreled away her own tiny stash under a floorboard for years. It's not much. But it's yours. You keep the coins hidden at first. You think, maybe I'll need them someday. For shoes. Or an emergency. Or just, for yourself. But the law has an opinion about that too. If your husband finds your secret stash, he has every right to take it. And should he choose to report it, you could be accused of theft, from your own household. In some jurisdictions, there were actual penalties for women who concealed money or goods after marriage. Not only would you lose the coins, you'd also face social shame and legal consequences. Because of course, anything concealed was something that should have been his all along. And it doesn't stop at goats and coin purses. If you inherit something while married, say, your aunt dies and leaves you a bit of jewelry or a field near the river, it legally becomes your husband's to manage. You may wear the ring. You may help harvest the field. But you can't sell it. You can't mortgage it. You can't even argue about how it's used, unless your husband feels particularly generous that week. It's not just about objects either. It's about voice. You're not allowed to appear in court without your husband's permission. You can't sign contracts. You can't legally hire someone, even if you run the household like a seasoned steward. If a neighbor disputes a fence line or accuses your cow of trespassing, it's your husband who must respond. Not because he knows more about the cow, he doesn't. But because he owns your legal agency, just as he owns your apron and your bread paddle. And yes, even your labor belongs to him. When you bake bread, he owns the loaves. When you spin wool, he owns the thread. If he chooses to sell your work at market, he pockets the profit. If he doesn't like how you spend your day, he can forbid you from certain tasks, or demand you do others. You are, in every sense that the law understands, his property, in function, if not in name. But let's say he's a kind man. Thoughtful. Maybe he tells you, what's mine is yours. Maybe he lets you manage household money, or choose which pig to fatten. Maybe he even says, you're in charge while I'm gone. That's sweet. That's generous. But legally speaking, it's irrelevant. Because the moment he returns, so does his authority. And if he chooses to revoke your control, over the kitchen, the garden, the children, you have no formal recourse. Not unless you're willing to appeal to the church or the manor court. And even then, your chances are, let's say, modest. Historians still debate the degree to which women accepted this arrangement. Was it simply how things had always been? Did women internalize these roles so deeply that they never questioned them? Or did they push back, quietly, subversively, through whispers and workarounds? There's evidence for both. In some letters and legal records, we find women asserting control with clever legal language, adding clauses to marriage contracts, negotiating joint ownership, even demanding that certain property be held in trust for their children rather than their husbands. In a few rare cases, women even sued their husbands for misuse of their dowries. But these women were often wealthy, educated, or unusually well-connected. For the average woman, quiet endurance was safer. You learn to carve out small domains. The spice jar. The cupboard key. The way you fold the laundry just so, and how you mark the flour sack when he's not looking. You learn the rhythm of his footsteps, the difference between generosity and guilt, and how to say yes in a way that buys you time. Sometimes, your strategies work. You get the extra eggs you wanted. You plant the carrots where you prefer. You save a handful of beans for your neighbor whose baby is sick. Other times, it all crumbles. Your goat gets sold. Your favorite spoon is given away to his cousin. The coins under the mattress are discovered and gone before you can say a word. And yet, the world still turns. Because for all the rules, for all the laws and customs, you're still here, bending, adapting, surviving. And you know something the law doesn't. You know how to run a household with one eye closed. You know which herbs help with cramps and which ones the priest thinks are sinful. You know how to trade favors with the baker's wife, how to bake bread with less flour, how to stretch broth for one more day. You've lost everything, on parchment. But not in practice. Because the law may claim your goat, your land, your name. But your wit, your endurance, your quiet, indestructible strength, that, he can never truly own. Only death might grant you property, but only if the math, and the men, agree. You're older now. Not old like the hunched widow with the blue shawl who mutters to her chickens, but old enough that the neighbor's sons no longer tease you by name, and the milkmaid's daughter has started calling you mistress, even when you tell her not to. You've birthed children, 2 who lived, 1 who didn't, and you've managed to keep the same husband alive for more than a decade, which is an achievement in its own right. You've grown into your bones. Your feet know every uneven patch of the yard without looking. Your fingers have developed a memory of their own, kneading dough, wrapping bandages, tightening knots, coaxing fire from damp kindling. There's not a lot of time to think. But sometimes, in the lull between twilight and sleep, a thought slides in like cold air beneath the door. What if he dies? Not in the dramatic way stories like to tell it. Not falling from a tower or slayed in a duel. No. Just quietly. A cough that deepens. A fall from a ladder. A fever after harvest. A misstep on a slippery church stair. And then what? You wouldn't call it wishing. It isn't that. But you'd be lying if you said the thought didn't come with its own strange mix of dread and something else. A flicker of space. A little air in the room. Because in a world where your legal identity was swallowed whole the moment you married, widowhood is, paradoxically, the closest thing to freedom you're ever likely to taste. You remember what it was like before the marriage, before the children, before your name changed in the church register and then vanished from the legal ones. You were your father's daughter, which was limiting in its own right, but at least you had some potential. You could be betrothed, bargained with, offered, yes, but also protected, in theory. There was a kind of attention in being unmarried. Not respect, perhaps. But a watchfulness. Now, as a wife, you're not watched. You're used. Your hands are expected to know things no one ever formally taught you. Your back is expected to bear weight that no one praises. Your voice is expected to stay soft, unless you're calling in the geese or the children. And legally, you are, quite literally, nothing. But if he dies, just imagine. You'd still be expected to mourn, of course. Wear black. Lower your eyes. Walk more slowly for a while, as if sadness makes your feet heavy. The priest would come by. Neighbors would bring broth. A cousin would suddenly take interest in your firewood supply. You would nod. You would thank them. You would wait. Because after the ritual of grief ends, something else begins, the legal reckoning. You've heard the term before, in low voices at the well or behind veils at church, dower. It's a right, not a gift, that entitles a widow to a portion of her late husband's estate. 1/3, if the custom holds. 1/3 of the land, the livestock, the tools, the income. Not ownership, no. Let's not get carried away. But use. Control. A say. That's what you begin to think about. The rye field, maybe. Or the 2 pigs. Or the portion of the roof that doesn't leak quite as badly. But nothing is guaranteed. And everything hinges on the math, and the men. First, the math. You must know what your husband actually had. Sometimes even he didn't know. The debts. The leases. The coin tucked behind the beam in the kitchen. The whispered promises to nephews, the handshake agreements in taverns. You can't claim what you can't prove. And if it's not written down, or witnessed, or repeated in the right ears, it may as well not exist. Then, the men. The reeve, who oversees local land disputes and always smells faintly of turnips. The steward, who insists on proper seals. The priest, who believes widowhood is holy, but not too holy, lest it make you proud. And your husband's relatives, who may suddenly emerge like mushrooms after a rain, all claiming to remember things differently than you do. Some will offer sympathy. Some will bring baskets of dried apples. And some will ask if perhaps, since you're alone now, you've thought about marrying again. You haven't. Not seriously. Because you know the rule, remarriage erases dower. It's the reset button no one mentions in sermons. If you choose a second husband, you walk back into coverture, his name, his rules, his legal umbrella. Your claim to your first husband's estate will slip through your fingers like spilled flour. So maybe you don't remarry. Maybe you wrap yourself in the dignity of modest mourning, light a candle each night, and become something new, a woman alone. It's a rare role, but not an unrespected one. Some widows wield it like a blade. They run market stalls. Lease fields. Lend seed. Speak sharply to men who once ignored them. You've seen them in town. Sturdy, confident, with no need to lower their voices. One widow you know runs a brewery. Her beer is better than most men's. She hires boys to carry the barrels and tells them which feet to stand on. She once turned down a marriage proposal from a magistrate. "I've had one man in my house," she said. That was enough. Another keeps geese and rents grazing land to shepherds. She's quiet but firm, and the children in the village believe she can tell the future. She can't. But she can read weather better than most men and doesn't care who knows it. You admire them. You envy them, too. But you also know it's not that simple. Widowhood can be lonely. Dangerous, even. A woman alone is a target. If you don't have sons, or if your sons are too young, you might find yourself gently, or not so gently, nudged off the land you helped tend for years. The excuse might be legal. Or moral. Or practical. But the outcome is the same. Historians still argue over how many women actually exercised their dower rights successfully. Some suggest it was widespread in rural areas, especially when neighbors respected long-standing relationships. Others argue that even when the law favored widows on paper, the real-world enforcement depended entirely on the goodwill, or absence, of nearby men. And then there's the paperwork. Even if you're granted dower land, you can't sell it. You can't build on it without permission. You can't pass it down in a will. It's yours to use until you die or remarry, whichever comes first. Think of it like being handed the keys to a house you're only allowed to live in if you never paint the walls. Still, it's something. More than you had before. More than you'd have as a wife. A sliver of recognition in a system built to forget you. So you imagine it, sometimes. In the early morning, before the house stirs. You standing at the edge of the rye field, arms folded. Not waiting for approval. Just watching. Breathing. Knowing it's yours, for now. You keep your mouth closed around the thought. You don't speak it into being. But you tuck it away, like a seed in a pocket. Because you're not a widow yet. But one day, you might be. And on that day, after the tears and the candles and the burial and the neighbor's carefully phrased condolences, you'll pull that seed from your pocket, plant it, and see what grows. A small garden. A stubborn piece. A quiet patch of land that, for once, is yours. The church says marriage is sacred, even if he smells like boiled cabbage forever. You're older now. Not yet gray, but the black in your hair has dulled to something that looks suspiciously like ash when the light hits it just right. Your body has changed. You no longer bleed every month, at least not predictably, and your knees make soft little noises when you kneel too long. But you're not done. Not yet. There's bread to bake. Laundry to carry. A husband still alive and demanding stew that tastes like it came from a noble's hearth, though he's never tasted anything outside this village. You've been married longer than you were single. Longer than you expected, maybe. Long enough to know the sound of his cough in the dark. Long enough to recognize the way his silence shifts when he's angry. Long enough that even the dog rolls its eyes when he tells the same story for the 100th time about that one time he wrestled a pig for fun. And, of course, long enough to begin wondering. Softly, silently, what would happen if you weren't here? Not violently. You're not plotting anything. But when he snores beside you, smelling faintly of boiled cabbage and church incense, and you lie awake thinking about the moonlight on the windowsill and the cool air between your toes, the thought floats in. What if I didn't have to do this anymore? Could you leave? Just, get up and walk out. Could you take the children, the kettle, maybe the better blanket, and go somewhere else? The answer, of course, is no. You cannot divorce him. You cannot leave him. You cannot even say the words, "I don't want to be married anymore," without causing something that feels dangerously close to scandal. Because you are married, and in your time and place, marriage is not a partnership, it is a sentence. You married in the church. With vows. With candles and prayers and a priest who intoned sacred Latin syllables you didn't understand, and didn't dare interrupt to ask. You were told this was forever. Not until love fades. Not until he forgets your name. Until death. Real, cold, buried in the ground death. There's no divorce in medieval England. Not in the way you think of it. Not as escape. Not as freedom. Not even as choice. The church doesn't allow divorce. It allows annulment, which is a very different creature. Annulment doesn't end a marriage, it erases it. Declares it never truly happened. That the union was invalid from the beginning. And for that, you'd need evidence. You'd have to prove that you and your husband were closely related, like second cousins, or worse. Or that one of you was underage. Or already secretly married. Or impotent. Or forced. Or, best of all, not mentally competent at the time. Which is funny. Because you were certainly not mentally competent at the time. You were 16 and terrified and thinking more about whether your feet were clean than whether you loved this man. But that doesn't count. You stayed. You bore children. You baked bread and smiled through feast days and folded his shirts and bent your will like you bend a straw broom at the end of the day. Too late now. You've heard of women, mostly noble women, petitioning the Pope for annulments. Years of letters. Bribes. family alliances, threats. The church moves slowly. Sometimes deliberately. Sometimes not at all. But those are duchesses, queens, people with names carved into ledgers. You are a wife. Just a wife. Your name is written only on the inside of your flour sack, and even that will fade. So what's left? There is, technically, something called a separation from bed and board. A church-sanctioned arrangement where a couple lives apart due to cruelty or desertion. You keep your vow to stay married, but you don't have to share a roof. It's rare. It's expensive. It requires witnesses. And worst of all, it means you can never remarry. Even if your husband runs off to France, joins a pirate ship, falls off the side of a monastery, and is declared dead, if there's no proof, if there's no body, you're still married. Trapped in a union without a partner. So maybe you try something smaller. You stop speaking at dinner. You spend longer at the market. You linger near the convent and wonder what it smells like inside. You think about going to the bishop, but you remember the way he looked at you last Easter when you asked if women could take confession from anyone other than him. You mention, casually, carefully, that your husband sometimes drinks too much. That he's rough. That he doesn't help. The baker's wife frowns sympathetically and then changes the subject. The priest talks about patience. The neighbor says, well, at least he hasn't run off. Everyone means well. No one has answers. And so you stay. You tend the hearth. You fold the laundry. You memorize the creak in the door hinge that tells you when he's home and when you need to stop humming. You learn to live around him, like ivy growing around a stone. Sometimes, you feel guilty for thinking this way. He's not a monster. He doesn't beat you often. He's never cursed you in public. He remembers your name. But you remember your name too. The one you had before. The name that didn't end in S wife. The name that belonged to someone who once danced barefoot in the garden with muddy knees and sang louder than the birds. The name of someone who thought marriage meant a life together, not a life handed over. You teach your daughters different things. You show them how to make soup stretch further, yes. But you also show them how to recognize manipulation. How to smile without promising. How to say yes without meaning it. How to hide money in the seam of a hem. You tell them that love is not the same thing as obedience. That respect is not the same thing as fear. That sometimes, silence is the only way to survive. And when they ask if you're happy, you smile and say, I'm tired. Because that answer is always acceptable. You survive. You learn to carve out joy in tiny pieces, a warm pie, a quiet afternoon, a moment of softness that no one else notices. You grow flowers in broken pots. You save letters from a sister you haven't seen in years. You watch the sky. And sometimes, you imagine. You imagine what life would be like if you weren't married. If you had your own name on your own house. If you could open your own account in the ledger. If you could walk through the market without having to explain where your husband is and why you're carrying that much butter. You imagine a world where marriage is a choice, not a destiny. But then the pot boils. The baby cries. Your husband sneezes and calls your name. You come back. Because in your time, there are no papers to sign. No lawyer to call. No way to say, this is not working, and have anyone take you seriously. There is only patience. And quiet. And long walks to nowhere. So you wake up tomorrow. You stir the porridge. You tuck a sprig of rosemary behind your ear and pretend it's a crown. And you remind yourself. You cannot divorce him. But in the small places, behind the bread rack, under the bed, inside your heart, you might still be free. A little. You consider escaping. Spoiler, the church is not impressed. You've thought about it. Not seriously, maybe. But it crosses your mind more often than it should. The idea comes in small flashes. When you're hauling water for the third time that morning. When your husband forgets, again, that you like your bread toasted, not burned. When he drops his boots in the middle of the floor and waits for you to pick them up like they've grown roots. When he looks at you with the same blank expression he gives the cow. Maybe less affection. That's when the idea rises, what if you just left? Tied your shawl around a bundle of essentials, slipped out before dawn, followed the road past the field, through the woods, beyond the edge of the village, and kept walking. You wouldn't need much. A loaf of bread. Some dried apples. A coin or two. Maybe the sewing scissors. You'd change your name. Say your husband died. Say you never married. Say nothing. Start again somewhere else as a widow or a cousin or a washerwoman who talks very little. It's foolish, of course. But it's also thrilling. The church, however, is less thrilled. In your world, running away from a marriage is not just scandalous, it's criminal. You'd be labeled a fugitive wife. Desertion is grounds for punishment, especially if you take anything with you. Food, money, the children. Even the shirt on your back could be considered stolen property, if your husband wants to press charges. You'd likely be dragged back, by force or by pressure. The bailiff might come. The priest might sermonize about duty and the sanctity of suffering. The neighbors would whisper, and not kindly. Even your own mother might say, well, he's not the worst man, is he, as if that were the measure of a life. Historians still debate how many women actually tried to flee their marriages. Some accounts survive in court rolls. Women caught hiding in convents, living under assumed names, begging magistrates to grant them mercy. A few were successful. Many were not. But the very fact that these stories exist suggests that some women tried. Some tried other routes. You've heard of annulments, of course. You know they're not easy to get, but they're possible. You know the rules, you must prove the marriage was invalid from the start. How? Well, there are a few options. Most are complicated. You could claim consanguinity, that you and your husband are related within the prohibited degrees. You'd need a family tree. Or a priest willing to bend the branches a little. Or a sudden discovery that your mother's cousin married his aunt's niece twice removed. It sounds absurd, but it's worked before. Especially when land is involved. You could claim impotence. But that's awkward. It involves witnesses. Medical examinations. Possibly the church ordering your husband to, well, prove his case publicly. Most couples don't want that. You could say you were coerced into the marriage, or that it happened when you were too young to consent. Which might be true. You were barely 16, and you remember crying when your mother laced you into your best dress and told you not to fidget. But how do you prove it now, after a decade of shared porridge and children? You could even try to claim the marriage was never consummated. But 3 children later, that argument feels a bit ambitious. Still, you hear stories. A merchant's daughter who claimed her husband was possessed. A lady of the court who swore she had visions telling her the marriage displeased the Virgin Mary. A farmer's wife who argued that the priest mumbled the vows and God didn't hear them properly. Very bad excuses, your husband scoffs when he hears these tales. But you can't help wondering, bad or brave? One of your favorites is the tale of a woman from Norfolk who claimed that during the wedding ceremony, she had her fingers crossed. Crossed. Like a child hiding a lie. And somehow, the church took it seriously. Declared the marriage invalid. Sent her home with a clean slate and, one hopes, an improved life. Maybe the priest was sympathetic. Maybe her husband was terrible. Maybe she had money. Or maybe she was just lucky. You don't count on luck. So, instead of crossing your fingers, you cross your arms. You wait. You endure. You laugh with your friends at the market when they share rumors about the priest's sister running off with a tinker. You shake your head when the girl next door asks if it's true that women in Spain can refuse their husbands. You say, maybe, and don't push the question further. Still, you make small preparations. You don't write letters, you can't. But you remember names. Faces. Routes. You watch the trader who comes every third Wednesday. The one with the kind eyes and the slow mule. He tells stories about other towns. You ask what it's like in York. In London. In places where no one knows your face. You don't ask too many questions. You don't want anyone to notice. You start hiding a few coins. Nothing dramatic. Just the pennies that go missing from the egg money. You bury them under the floorboard. Behind the loose stone in the hearth. You tell yourself it's for emergencies, and in a way, it is. Not fire. Not famine. Freedom. Your husband never asks. He's too busy complaining about the cost of turnips. And you keep going. One foot in front of the other. One dish at a time. One breath after another. You hear other stories, too, of women who ran and were caught. There was one, not far from here, who made it as far as the next parish before the Reeves men dragged her back. Her husband beat her in the churchyard for all to see. The priest looked away. The villagers did too. They said she brought shame on herself. On her family. On the sanctity of marriage. But you remember her name. You whisper it sometimes, under your breath, when no one's around. There's another tale, less grim, of a woman who faked madness. She howled like a wolf. Spoke in tongues. Smeared ash on her cheeks. After 6 months, her husband sent her away to a convent. She recovered quickly. Took vows. Became a scribe. They say she smiles a lot now. You're not ready to howl. But you understand the impulse. So you wait. You learn. You whisper to your daughters what no one whispered to you. You say, if a man ever tells you you can't leave, don't believe him. You say, sometimes stories are the only maps we have. You say, there's always a door somewhere. You just have to find the right wall. And then you fold the laundry. Stir the stew. Sharpen the knife. Not for him. For the carrots. You survive. You carry the stories in your bones. The good ones. The bad ones. The ones where the woman makes it to the river. The ones where she doesn't. Because even if the church isn't impressed, even if the law looks away, even if your husband never notices, you know what you're capable of. And one day, maybe, the road will rise to meet you. And you'll walk. And you won't stop. Some widows and wealthy women do own land, but only by dancing through legal fire. You hear the word again, just as you're tying onions with twine in the back of the market, she owns it. It's whispered, of course, low and careful, as though simply speaking the phrase aloud might cause the church bell to toll, the sky to darken, and a very annoyed bishop to appear with a list of sins and a bucket of holy water. But still, she owns it. A piece of land. A shop. A vineyard. A millstone. A name on a ledger. A key to a lock that no man carries. You blink. And for a moment, the weight of your apron feels a little lighter. Because all your life, you've been told what you can't do. You can't own property. You can't sign contracts. You can't sue or be sued unless your husband agrees. You can't make decisions that matter. You can't even claim credit for the bread you bake, even though his hands never touched the dough. But then comes a story like this one. A widow in the next town who managed her husband's brewery after his death. She hired laborers. Collected payments. Sued a neighbor who tried to cut her barley too early. And won. Or the merchant's wife who ran the wool business for 10 years while her husband was on pilgrimage, which everyone knew meant he was drinking in France. When he returned, the books were so tidy, the profits so fat, that he made her a permanent partner in the guild. Quietly. Behind closed doors. Because women weren't allowed. But also, who else could read his handwriting? You begin to understand something. The rules are stone, but even stone has cracks. And some women, through wit, luck, and carefully timed silence, find a way to slide through them. You notice the pattern. First, the widows. They're everywhere, if you look. Some wear black veils and speak softly. Others wear old work skirts and speak not at all. But the ones who last, the ones who keep the house, the goats, the shop. Those are the ones who understood what marriage took from them and knew how to get a sliver of it back when the time came. You've seen them at the market, counting coin, inspecting apples. Their hands don't shake. Their eyes don't lower. They know what they own. Well, not own, not in the full, legal sense. Not the way a man might own a sword or a sheep or a stretch of riverbank. But in practice. In function. Close enough. You learn a new phrase, life tenancy. When a husband dies, and the will is kind, or at least clear, the widow is granted the right to use a portion of his land or property for the rest of her life. She can live there. Work it. Profit from it. But she cannot sell it. Cannot give it away. Cannot pass it to her children. It's like being handed a beautiful coat, then being told you can wear it every day, until the moment you fall asleep for good. Then it returns to the closet, and the door locks again. Still, it's something. And some women? They make it more than something. They invest. They trade favors. They learn who to pay, who to flatter, and when to say no with a smile so soft that the word feels like velvet. They build relationships with stewards, with scribes, even with young monks who copy documents and sometimes forget to look too closely at whose name is written where. Historians still argue whether these widows truly wielded power or merely borrowed it. But the court records say enough. Their names appear, more often than expected, for women who supposedly had no legal voice. Disputes. Claims. Petitions. Agreements. And sometimes, victories. You think of a woman in your own village. Old now, nearly 60, with a crooked back and a voice like gravel. Her husband died a decade ago, and since then she's lived on the edge of the field, her field, selling milk and dried herbs and stories of what the land was like before the last frost changed everything. No one challenges her. No one dares. Because she knows things. Like how much barley the miller stores off record. Like how often the steward forgets to tithe properly. Like where the old priest's letters are buried and which cousin never truly left town. Knowledge, you realize, is its own form of ownership. The second exception you begin to understand is wealth. Specifically, urban wealth. City women live by different rules, sometimes harsher, sometimes softer. The walls of the town give protection, yes. But they also hold tighter control. Still, in the chaos of trade and guilds and growing economies, some women manage to carve out slivers of autonomy. They inherit businesses when husbands die. They run inns, bakeries, apothecaries. Some are midwives, scribes, even chandlers, the makers of candles and gossip alike. A few even become lenders, holding coins others wish they had. They can't vote in the guild. They can't sit in council. But they're invited to dinners. Consulted before decisions. And sometimes, very quietly, men bring them contracts to review. Their names might not be written at the top, but their fingerprints are all over the ink. You meet one, once. Just once. She's passing through, on her way to visit her sister, or so she says. Her clothes are fine, but not flashy. Her shoes are soft leather, laced tightly. Her fingers are stained with ink. She buys 5 bolts of wool and pays without haggling. Then she leans in and asks you if the weaver you use has switched dyes. You blink. No one's ever asked that before. She nods. Says nothing more. Walks away. You remember her for months. Because you saw it, the loophole living inside her. Not a rebel. Not a lawbreaker. Just someone who found the one step in the dance where the rhythm stutters, and made it her own. Of course, for every story like hers, there are 10 of women who tried and failed. The baker's wife who ran the shop after her husband died, only to be evicted by his cousin. The widow who leased her orchard, only to be told her agreement wasn't binding. The merchant's daughter who built her father's accounts from scratch, only to watch them signed away at her wedding. And then there are the traps. Remarriage. The Great Reset. You can have property. Or a husband. But rarely both. Marry again, and your new husband inherits everything, your land use, your contracts, your control. If he's kind, he lets you manage things. If he's not, he sells the cow you raised, the land you loved, and tells you it's time to focus on bearing him a son. So some women refuse. They stay widows. Not because they're grieving, but because it's the only status that grants them space. They learn to play the system like a harp. They appear pious, but never too pious. They attend church, but sit in the back. They nod at the reeve, but never bow. They speak sweetly to the steward's wife, and bring eggs to the priest, and know exactly how many sacks of grain passed through the market gate last week. And then there are those who don't wait to be widowed. You've heard of one, a noble woman who, knowing her husband was ill, had a scribe draft multiple copies of their will. One for the church. One for the family. And one, just for her. Hidden. Precise. Waiting. When he died, there was confusion. Disagreement. But her version was the one the steward found first. By the time anyone realized, the deed had already been sealed. She wept at the funeral. But she smiled at the vineyard. You don't have a vineyard. You don't have a scribe. But you do have a ledger hidden inside a flour tin. 3 names memorized. A map drawn in charcoal, rolled behind the roof beam. You're not an exception. Not yet. But you're watching. Listening. Waiting for the seam in the stone to widen just a little. Because loopholes are not announced. They are discovered. Quietly. Carefully. Like a girl slipping through a crack in the garden wall just wide enough to fit a dream through. And you've always been good at finding cracks. Some women seemed powerful, queens, abbesses, noblewomen, but their authority had limits. You hear the bells before you see the tower. They ring out across the fields, deep and slow, tolling like the heartbeat of something older than time. The nuns say each chime reaches heaven. The villagers say each one costs a chicken. Either way, they mark something holy. Something higher. Something entirely beyond the reach of your muddy shoes. But today, you're not just passing by. You're walking toward it. A pilgrimage, they call it. Not a long one. Just a few miles to the local abbey to deliver herbs and honey on behalf of your village. But still, it feels like entering another world, one where women dress in black and white instead of earth and ash. Where voices float in Latin, and rules are written not by husbands, but by God. At the gate, a nun opens the door. She doesn't smile. She doesn't need to. Her hands are clean. Her veil is perfect. Her eyes are sharp. She says, "Follow me." And you do. Because here, inside these walls, women run the world. Or at least, that's how it looks. The abbess sits at a carved oak table, flanked by 2 scribes and a priest who barely speaks unless spoken to. She reads your offering list with a nod and thanks you in Latin. You don't understand the words, but the tone says, "You did well." And in that moment, you wonder. Is this what power feels like? You've always known women could be holy. Saints. Martyrs. Mothers of God. But holy and powerful? That's different. The abbess owns land. Dozens of acres. Orchards. Vineyards. Flocks. Her signature seals contracts. Her orders govern dozens of nuns, a small army of lay servants, and several villages. She even writes letters to the bishop, and expects answers. Technically, she's not a noble. But in practice, she might as well be a queen. She wears no crown. Wields no sword. Yet when she speaks, men listen. Even the local lord, who once arrived drunk to a feast, sobered instantly when she entered the hall. No one knows what she said to him. But the next day, his knights helped repair the convent wall, without being asked. Historians still argue whether abbesses truly had political power or were just well-dressed managers of land. But court records show them collecting taxes, settling disputes, and hosting royalty. Their abbeys became centers of not just religion, but culture, economy, and law. And most striking of all, they were often legally autonomous. That phrase again, like a flare in the fog. Unlike married women, who lived under coverture, abbesses, especially of wealthy or imperial abbeys, could sign contracts, appear in court, even command armies in certain regions. The church allowed them a kind of independence specifically because they had no husbands. Their marriage was to Christ. Their duty was to the faith. Their power? Sanctified. But of course, it wasn't that simple. Because their power came with conditions. The bishop could still overrule them. The pope could revoke privileges. And if the abbess became too political, too vocal, too successful, suddenly, there were questions about her faith, her purity, her loyalty. Letters were sent. Investigations launched. Chaplains reassigned. One wrong sermon. One unpopular decision. And the holy woman became a problem. You've heard stories. An abbess in the north who refused to sell part of her forest to a baron. Within months, she was accused of mismanaging funds. Her nuns were relocated. Her office dissolved. Another was rumored to have healed the sick, too many, too quickly. Whispers of sorcery. A tribunal. She vanished. Even here, where incense curls like prayer and marble floors gleam like frozen milk, you feel it, their power is borrowed. Fragile. Conditional. Then there are the queens. You've never seen one. Not truly. Just paintings in a chapel and stories told by travelers. But the idea of them follows you like the scent of lavender on your sleeves. A woman in furs. A woman with a crown. A woman sitting beside the king, not behind him, not beneath him, but beside him. Surely, she holds more power than any villager, any merchant's wife, any abbess. Right? You'd think so. But then you hear the stories. One queen who tried to negotiate a peace treaty, only to be told it was unseemly. Another who funded hospitals for women and was accused of neglecting military duty. A third who dared to question her husband's execution of a noble, and was locked in a tower for 10 years. Historians still argue over how much influence queens actually had. Some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Isabella of Castile, left undeniable marks on law, culture, and conquest. Others were ceremonial shadows, draped in silk, drowned in duty. The truth, as always, is murky. Because queens did have power. But it was soft power, the kind that persuades rather than commands. That soothes tensions, fosters alliances, arranges marriages. Power that speaks in whispers behind curtains, not in decrees stamped in wax. It's not that they weren't intelligent. or strategic, or formidable. They were. But their influence was filtered through the men around them. To be a powerful queen, you had to be acceptable, modest, fertile, devoted. Step outside that mold, and you became dangerous. You hear about one queen, Margaret of Denmark, who ruled as regent while her son was too young. For years, she governed 3 kingdoms, appointed ministers, managed trade, kept peace. When her son came of age, she was expected to step aside. She didn't. And for a while, the world let her stay. Because she was too competent, too necessary. But history remembers her with a question mark. A woman who ruled, but only because no man could. Then there's the noblewomen. Not quite queens. Not quite commoners. Ladies of the manor. Daughters of dukes. Wives of lords who rode off to war and left the estate behind. You'd think they would be fragile, delicate. But you've met a few. And delicate is not the word. They manage households larger than your entire village. They write letters in Latin, negotiate dowries, organize feasts for 100 guests, and mediate disputes between tenants. They remember names, prices, grievances. Some even hold land in their own right, usually as part of a dowry, or a failed male bloodline. And if they are widowed, especially with no sons, sometimes they rule outright. Their seal becomes law. Their word, policy. Their signature, a contract. But only until the king appoints a new guardian. Or a cousin appears with a stronger claim. Or the church decides she's been too generous with tithes and not generous enough with humility. You see the pattern. No matter how powerful these women seem, how high they climb, how richly they dress, how wide their influence, their power is always watched. It's granted, allowed, tolerated, and always, always, revocable. You think of your own life, your own limitations. You are not an abbess, not a queen, not a noblewoman. But you see echoes of their struggles in your own. The need to be perfect, but not threatening. To be clever, but not too clever. To speak, but never too loudly. To hold power, but never admit you want it. And still, you wonder. If even queens can be silenced, what hope do you have? But then again, if abbesses can run villages. If noblewomen can manage estates. If one nun's prayer can sway a king. Then maybe, just maybe, your voice, soft, persistent, and tethered to truth, can shape something too. Even if it's just a better day for your daughter. Or a quieter night for yourself. You leave the abbey as the bells ring again. Their sound feels different now. Not holy. Not heavy. Just, real. Like women's voices, echoing in stone. Reminding the world they were here. That they mattered. That they ruled. Not always with permission, but always with purpose. Even if history tried to forget. You're no duchess, no crowned noblewoman riding in a parade or signing treaties beside marble pillars. You're a merchant's wife in Florence, or maybe Venice, Genoa, or Siena. Your world smells of parchment, drying herbs, wax-sealed letters, citrus oil, and damp stone. You live behind wooden shutters carved with fleur-de-lis or lions rampant, in a house that's tall and narrow, its walls lined with tapestries to hold in warmth and to muffle secrets. The kitchen is on the ground floor, the bedchamber above the noise and soot of the street, and somewhere between is the small desk where you keep the household accounts locked in a carved chest. Outside, the city sings in the music of commerce, water sloshing in gondolas, hammers clanging in goldsmith shops, boys shouting over baskets of wool, and monks shuffling past velvet-cloaked merchants haggling over pepper, silk, or borrowed coin. But behind the din, there's another world. It exists in the silences between bells, in the whispered transactions over embroidery frames, and the knowing glances exchanged in candlelight. It's the world of merchant wives, silent strategists who know more than they are ever credited for. You are expected to be obedient, pious, modest, but you are not expected to be idle. Idleness is dangerous. Idleness is suspicious. A proper wife keeps her hands busy, her lips quiet, and her mind sharp. When your husband leaves on a trading voyage, to Avignon, to Constantinople, to Flanders, you do not simply wait by the window. You run the household. You manage servants, arrange dowries, oversee apprentices, and, above all, protect the family's wealth and reputation. Marriage in Florence or Venice is no fairy tale. It is not love sealed by divine will, it is a transaction, a merger, a chess match between families. You were married young, perhaps 14, perhaps 16, to a man chosen for his alliances and assets. Your dowry was your entry fee into the game, and the larger it was, the more leverage you gained, not in romance, but in security. But once the marriage is sealed and the veil lifted, your influence is not fixed, it evolves, expands in the shadows, flourishes where no law dares to acknowledge. You are not a public figure, and yet you know the pulse of the city. You hear which banker's nephew gambled away the spice profits. You hear that the silversmith's apprentice is sleeping with the tanner's daughter, and you know this matters because the tanner's father owns the land your cousin wants. You visit convents and return with whispers of a noblewoman seeking a quiet annulment. You chat with your friend about a wedding menu, but your real focus is the notary she mentioned, whose memory is slipping, whose price is falling. You take these fragments and weave them into opportunity. On paper, you do not own property. But through sons, nephews, and sometimes even a trusted servant, you have influence. You purchase a vineyard under your son's name. You trade bolts of wool for a small share in a dye workshop. You quietly secure your daughter's dowry in advance, just in case your husband dies before the silk shipment arrives. You do not break laws. You bend them, wrap them in linen, lace them into the hems of your household linens. And when illness comes for your husband, and it always does, in the end, you are ready. You mourn. You wear the veil. You organize the funeral mass, count the candles, supervise the mourners. But beneath the surface, you begin to move. You review the accounts, summon the notary, renegotiate the lease on the second warehouse. You act as guardian to your children and broker their future with careful hands. Widowhood does not erase your power, it refines it. It frees you, in many ways, from the oversight of a man whose name always came first on the contracts. You've heard the stories. Some women, always quietly, become lenders. One widow in Lucca lends grain and collects repayment in olive oil. Another in Venice rents rooms to foreign traders and collects their news as eagerly as she collects their coins. A woman in Bologna manages 3 apprentices under her dead husband's name and is rumored to have authored 2 recipe books and 1 political letter to the city council, though no one will say it aloud. These stories are never told in public, never written in ink. But they are real. Power, for women like you, is not thunder, it is fog. It seeps into rooms and settles into ledgers. It's the gift of knowing when to nod and when to remain silent. It's passing an unsigned note through the market cheese vendor who owes you a favor. It's giving a priest's niece a new bonnet so that he will bless your son's contract faster than he blesses your rivals. You do not confront enemies, you outlast them. Even in faith, you move carefully. You sponsor masses, light candles, commission a small fresco of Saint Anne. But you also understand that appearances matter. You arrange for your daughter to learn Latin, not for prayer, but for business. You ensure your servant is literate, because sometimes letters must be delivered quickly and precisely. You teach your son to smile and your daughter to remember everything said in a room. Historians rarely write about you. They tell stories of Dante, of Cosimo de' Medici, of Machiavelli. But they forget who paid the priest to say the daily masses. Who arranged the marriages that joined rival houses. who managed the silk trade while the guildmaster was too drunk to stand. Your name may be absent from the archives, but your shadow lies over every corner of the city-state. Every stone path, every tiled roof, every wine contract signed during Lent. Behind the lace curtains and the rosaries and the modest laughter at feast days, you play a long game. You count dowries like soldiers. You build alliances with almond cookies and quiet loyalty. You never shout. You never boast. But you win. And when your granddaughter inherits your ring and your ledger, she will know, long before any man suspects, that she holds the key to a kingdom no map dares to show. You're a widow now. You've done the mourning, worn the black veil, stood beside the grave while the priest droned on about ashes and eternity. You fed the neighbors who came to offer condolences, listened to your husband's cousins speculate about what you'll do next, and accepted the stew from the miller's wife even though you hate the taste of thyme. And now the food is gone, the candles are out, and the silence in your cottage is louder than it's ever been. But beneath that silence, something else has started to stir, a sliver of self that was buried during all those years of coverture. And the law, as twisted and inconsistent as it may be, now calls you by name. You're a widow, and that means you can finally act like a legal person. But what kind of person you'll be, that's up to you. Most women keep to the script. They manage their dower lands, keep their heads down, and let the world see them as quiet stewards of what their husbands left behind. They remarry, perhaps, or live out their days near grandchildren, always with a hand folded over their purse strings and the other clutching a rosary. But not everyone follows that path. Some widows, whether through necessity or sheer grit, choose something else. And when they do, the world takes notice. Take, for example, the widow who refused to hand her grain stores to the local steward when he claimed a sudden tithe was due. She barred the door, stood in front of her sacks of rye, and told the steward he could pry them from her cold, dead hands. The steward left, red-faced and empty-handed, and came back with the bailiff. She met him with a kitchen knife. Word traveled fast. She was fined, of course, but she paid it with coin she found in her late husband's hidden stash. After that, no one asked her for grain again. Or the widow who leased her land to tenant farmers directly, cutting the manor lord out of his traditional share. When confronted, she presented a letter. Clearly forged, but well done, stating that her husband had granted her full rights in perpetuity. She argued so confidently, so precisely, that even the local reeve couldn't untangle her claims. She held that land for 10 years before anyone dared challenge her again. There's also the widow who ran a successful textile workshop, employing a dozen women and undercutting male weavers in the nearby town. She was summoned to court 3 times, once for selling goods without guild permission, once for using imported dyes, and once because a man claimed she had bewitched his looms. Each time, she arrived in a perfectly legal gown, veil pinned just so, speaking in low, careful tones. She won every case. And her workshop kept running. These women weren't anomalies because they were skilled or lucky. They were anomalies because they broke the unwritten rule that widows must remain small. Society tolerates female survival, it even praises it, as long as it's quiet and pious. But it bristles at female ambition, especially when it comes from someone no longer under the direct supervision of a man. Once you step outside that expectation, even slightly, you're viewed with suspicion. Your own neighbors whisper about you now. They wonder why you haven't hired your brother-in-law to help with the field. Why you speak to the tanner directly, instead of sending a boy. Why your skirts are cleaner than they should be for a widow who works. They notice these things, catalog them, like beads on a prayer string. And when they talk, their voices slide effortlessly from concern to judgment. And the church? The church sees everything through the stained glass of doctrine. A strong widow is either a saint or a scandal. If you're charitable, quiet, generous with alms, they might elevate you, see you as a pillar of feminine virtue. But if you're shrewd, wealthy, assertive, or worse, sexually independent, you're a threat. Maybe not outright heretical, but certainly unseemly. And it only takes a few rumors to shift your image from respected matron to something darker. Something dangerous. You've heard of other widows accused of witchcraft. Not for brewing potions or dancing in moonlight, but for owning too many goats, for refusing suitors, for knowing the price of grain before anyone else. One widow in a nearby village was dragged before the ecclesiastical court because she dared build a stone wall without consulting her late husband's cousin. They claimed she was consorting with spirits. Really, they just didn't like her independence. She was acquitted, barely, and told to keep her head down. There's an edge you walk now. On one side, respectability, a manageable household, modest income, humility. On the other side, power, control over your land, your goods, your life. Lean too far into the latter, and suddenly you're difficult. You're deviant. You're the kind of woman who needs correction. And yet, you walk it anyway. Because there's something in you that has remembered its shape, something that coverture tried to erase. You've learned how to write your name, how to spot dishonest waits at the market, how to argue in court with just enough reverence to pass. You've learned that when you speak in the right tone, when you invoke scripture selectively, when you smile without showing teeth, you can move small mountains. Historians still argue whether widows like you were rare or simply undocumented. Some claim most women followed the rules, preferred safety to struggle. Others believe many quietly bent the system, just enough to survive, without attracting too much attention. Perhaps the truth lies in the stories that weren't written down, the quiet triumphs, the everyday negotiations, the times you traded a jar of honey for silence or lent a hen in exchange for loyalty. Whatever the case, your days now are different. You wake not to a husband's orders, but to your own list of tasks. You choose when to patch the roof, when to plant the beans, when to sit beside the fire and let yourself remember. You still wear the veil, of course, it's custom, but it's looser now, more of a suggestion than a statement. And sometimes, when no one is looking, you take it off and let the air touch your scalp like a secret. At night, you listen for sounds outside, the barn settling, the fox rustling through the brush, the far-off cry of someone who drank too much at the tavern. You are alone, but not lonely. You are seen, but not owned. And tomorrow, when the steward comes by to inquire about the rent, you'll smile. You'll offer him tea. And if he asks too many questions, you'll remind him, gently, that this land is under your name now. Just yours. For as long as you choose. You're standing outside the manor court. The hem of your dress is damp with morning dew, and your hands twist a linen scrap that once belonged to your grandmother. It's not fear exactly that keeps your shoulders tight, it's more like the weight of knowing that once you step forward, you'll be marked. Marked as a woman who speaks. Marked as someone who brought her private grievances into a public square. Marked as trouble. You know the risks. You've heard the whispers at the well, behind hands at the market. Women aren't supposed to come here. Not unless they've been dragged. But you came on your own. Because something happened, and that something was unfair, and today, you've chosen to stand up for it, even if your voice shakes. Even if no one listens. Medieval courts are nothing like the stories people tell later. There are no powdered wigs, no gavels, no stoic rows of black-robed judges. Here, the court might be a corner of the manor hall, smelling of wood smoke and dried rushes, or maybe just a wide spot beneath a spreading tree near the village green. The bailiff presides, the steward records, and every eye that knows your name is watching. It's not justice in the modern sense, it's community memory and local control, wrapped in custom and power. If you're here about a stolen hen or a boundary dispute, maybe the crowd will listen with curiosity. But if your case is about you, your body, your marriage, your voice, then the tone shifts. Sympathy evaporates. Eyes narrow. You stop being a neighbor. You become a spectacle. The process begins before you even speak. You need a writ, a formal permission to bring your case. That writ usually must be secured through a male guardian. Your father, if he's alive. Your brother, if he's present. Your husband, if he isn't the problem. If you're a widow, you may have some room to maneuver. If you're single and of age, you might be allowed to stand alone. But if you're married, and your husband is the one who's harmed you, the irony becomes a prison. You need his permission to prosecute him. You are, in legal terms, a femme covert. Covered. Not unlike a locked chest. Anything you possess, rights, property, autonomy, rests beneath the lid of your husband's authority. And the court knows it. They repeat the phrase often, like a hymn, the woman is under her husband's hand. Yet, even within these restrictions, some women manage to speak. They file lawsuits. They appear in witness boxes. They contest land, debt, and dignity. There's the weaver's widow from the next village who sued over unpaid wages and received 2 goats and a barrel of cider. There's the tanner's daughter who challenged her cousin over a dowry promise and lost, not because she was wrong, but because her witnesses were women. And there's the herb woman who took a case against a man who slandered her healing with the word witch, and managed, through wit and sharp memory, to walk out with his public apology scrawled in the court roll. Exceptions, yes, but real. Still, the courtroom is far from neutral ground. A woman's testimony is fragile currency. In many towns, 2 female witnesses are required to equal 1 male. In some courts, female testimony is admissible only if no men were present. If you were the only one who saw the crime, you may be discounted entirely. The justifications vary: emotional instability, physical weakness, susceptibility to influence, even theories about the moon's control over your monthly bleeding. The law books don't always write it so plainly, but the clerks and the bailiffs and the scribes enforce it as gospel. Women are less reliable, less rational, less human, in the eyes of the law. And so you remember what happened to your neighbor's daughter. She saw the Reeves apprentice knock her brother to the ground with a plank of firewood. She swore to it in court. She wept, trembling with the burden of truth. But the court said she was too young, too close to the victim, too female. The apprentice walked free. Her brother limped for weeks. And the girl? She stopped speaking in public. Not from fear, but from understanding. The system didn't want her voice. It wanted her silence. Still, court is one of the few places where a woman's life leaves a mark. In the dusty rolls stored behind church altars or in manor chests, your name might appear. Your grievance. Your words. Your moment of courage. It might be your only written legacy. You won't have books, most likely. You won't be recorded in family histories unless you're noble. But here, in faded ink and clumsy Latin, there will be proof you lived. Proof you mattered, if only for the span of a hearing. Historians continue to debate how much influence women truly wielded in these spaces. Some argue that female legal agency was more common than expected, that women sued, negotiated, advocated with quiet determination. Others believe that these cases are rare precisely because they were so hard to achieve, so dependent on male intermediaries and social standing. Both views carry truth. Much depended on the century, the region, the lord in charge, and the woman herself. Some places had customs that protected widows' rights. Others erased them entirely the moment a brother-in-law showed up with a forged deed. Then there were the ecclesiastical courts, the church-run tribunals that handled morality and marriage. Here, women were more visible. Accused of fornication, adultery, gossip, or spiritual neglect, they appeared in these settings frequently, often as defendants, sometimes as plaintiffs. You've seen it yourself. A wife who reports her husband for abandoning her. A young girl accused of lying with a novice monk. A midwife questioned over rumors of using charms. The charges were personal. The punishments, public. You remember the woman who had to carry a candle barefoot through the village square for the sin of slander. Her words, they said, had stained the community. The man she spoke about was never summoned. Never shamed. Never made to explain. Still, women sometimes turned the tide. A wife who presented evidence of her husband's mistress. A laundress who proved her employer touched her without permission. A nun who uncovered a bishop's corruption and passed notes to Rome. These were flickers, yes, but real. Moments when the system, heavy with tradition and bias, bent, just slightly, in the direction of truth. You've learned how to navigate this world. Your mother taught you how to fold your hands just right. Your aunt told you when to cry and when not to. Your grandmother reminded you never to speak until asked. And so when your case is called, you step forward carefully. You speak without trembling. You present your evidence, marks on your arm, missing coins, neighbors who heard the shouting. You swear upon saints. You hold your breath. And the court listens. Maybe only briefly. Maybe with disinterest. But they listen. And if they rule against you, you'll nod. You'll curtsy. You'll walk out slowly. But inside, a piece of you will have changed. Because you stood in a place that wasn't built for you, and you claimed it. Not with fists, not with fire, but with words. And somewhere, on a parchment roll tucked in a wooden chest, your name remains. She lives at the edge of the village, just past the last row of cottages where the grass turns wild and the path narrows into nothing but dirt and silence. Her house is small, with a crooked roof patched by time and instinct, and windows clouded by the slow breath of years. Ivy curls around the frame like a secret kept too long, and in the garden, where the soil seems to listen better than people do, she grows plants no one else dares name aloud. Mugwort, betony, foxglove, rue, things the priest warns against, but the women remember. You've passed her house many times, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose, and though you walk quickly, your eyes linger. Not because you fear her, but because she holds something that the world doesn't know what to do with, knowledge that isn't blessed by a bishop or passed down by a man. In this world, knowledge is not neutral. A man with books is a scholar. A woman with remedies is a risk. You understand this early, though no one teaches it outright. It seeps in, the way smoke slips through the cracks of a shutter, unseen but unmistakable. Healing without permission, helping without approval, knowing things without being taught by the right sort of person, these are all dangerous. And yet, when your mother burned with fever, it wasn't the monk who saved her. It was the woman by the woods, with her roots and her tinctures and her hands that knew where to press. Your father didn't thank her. But you did. Quietly. With a glance and a loaf of bread left on her doorstep at dawn. They call her a witch. Not always aloud, but often enough. Sometimes they whisper it when she walks by. Sometimes they spit it like poison if a cure fails, if a child doesn't live, if a crop still withers. The same people who kneel at her door at midnight will turn their backs on her in daylight. Her reputation lives in the space between gratitude and fear. You see it happen again and again. A poultice that heals is called a miracle, until the second one doesn't. Then it's sorcery. A birth aided by herbs is divine grace, until the baby won't breathe. Then it's a curse. The line between healer and heretic is drawn in water, shifting with every ripple of gossip, every change in the wind. If she smiles too freely, she's tempting. If she frowns, she's bitter. If she knows too much, she's dangerous. And the danger isn't in what she does. It's in the fact that she does it at all. Without permission. Without apology. Without pretending not to understand. That kind of woman makes people uneasy. And uneasy people talk. You remember stories. Everyone does. Of women ducked in rivers, of trials held in fields, of names scratched from records. There was one tale about a woman from the next shire who read the stars, whose remedies helped soldiers return from war without fever. Until one of them died. Then they said she'd stolen his spirit. She was tried before the manor court, not for murder, but for knowing too much. They made her walk barefoot through the village. They burned her books. She disappeared. Maybe she fled. Maybe she didn't. And yet, the knowledge endures. Passed hand to hand, word to word, in kitchens and gardens, under breath. You learn it from your aunt, who says chamomile for nerves and comfort for bone. From your neighbor, who warns never to pick foxglove before moonrise. From the woman by the woods, who gives you a satchel of herbs and says only, "This is for when the blood won't stop." She never says more than she needs. You listen anyway. Because when the pain comes, it's her instructions you'll follow. The church tells you that only God heals. That pain purifies. That suffering draws you closer to heaven. But when your child coughs blood, you don't want heaven. You want help. And help wears a rough shawl, smells of vinegar and ash, and never asks for thanks. Just silence. Just secrecy. Just survival. There are records, hidden in manorial rolls, scribbled in Latin, guarded by clerks who never met the women they write about, of those who dared to help too publicly. They're listed not by name, but by sin. A woman who brewed without license. A widow who sold herbs of unknown origin. A spinster who spoke charms over livestock. The words change. The punishment doesn't. Fines, exile, shame. Or worse. You wonder how many of them knew their names would be erased, their lives reduced to footnotes. You wonder if they cared. But not all stories end in flames. Some women survive. Some thrive. There's a midwife 2 villages over who attends every birth, noble and common alike. They call her Mother Elm. Her hands have brought more souls into the world than the parish priest has buried. She's old now. No one dares accuse her. Not because they don't believe, but because they know they'd have no one to call when the next labor starts. And then there are the women who hide their knowledge behind acceptable faces. The baker's wife who adds fennel to the bread of those with weak stomachs. The brewer who knows which herbs soothe grief. The weaver who ties red thread through a tunic to ward off nightmares. These women are not witches. But neither are they harmless. They are the quiet backbone of survival. And their power, though unspoken, runs deep. You keep a ledger in your mind. Not on parchment, that would be foolish, but in memory. Which herbs for burns? Which teas for cramps? Which roots to chew for toothache? You teach your daughter, not with lessons, but with tasks. Pick that. Stir this. Remember the smell. She doesn't ask why. Not yet. One day she will. And you'll tell her. Carefully. Because power like this is passed, not seized. And it must be wrapped in silence. Not because it's shameful, but because it's sacred. Sometimes, you dream of a world where the word, which means wise, not wicked. Where a woman can speak openly of what she knows. Where gardens are places of pride, not suspicion. Where healing is honored, not hidden. In your dreams, there are schools for girls like you, with shelves of herbs and books that carry women's names on their spines. But dreams are fragile things. So you tend yours carefully. In sleep. In secrecy. In strength. And each morning, you rise. You pull your shawl over your shoulders. You check your herbs. You wash your hands. You grind. You mix. You heal. And you wait. For the knock at your door. For the whispered question. For the moment when knowledge, quietly held, becomes salvation. Because they may not call you a healer. They may not thank you. But when they come to you. And that, in the end, is all the proof you need that your power, though feared, is real. You don't enter the convent as a visionary. You're led there, gently but firmly, by hands that mean well, or at least believe they do. Maybe you're the third daughter, with no dowry and no suitor. Maybe your family can't afford to split their land again, and cloistering you secures the inheritance. Maybe a relative has influence in the church and makes a place for you behind stone walls. Or maybe, just maybe, you come because you've seen the rest of the world, and you've chosen silence over servitude. It's rare, but not unheard of. The convent is not what people think. It isn't all incense and hymns, endless prayers and holy visions. It is routine. Earthy. Physical. You rise before dawn, eat in silence, scrub floors, tend gardens, copy texts, grind pigment, chant in Latin until your knees ache and your voice grows hoarse. Your days are ordered by bells, not whims. And yet within this strict rhythm, something strange happens. You begin to feel like a person. Not someone's daughter. Not someone's wife. Just yourself. Cloistered, yes. But unowned. The world outside sees you differently now. They think you've renounced everything, ambition, desire, even identity. But inside these walls, you found something the world rarely gives women: space. Physical space. Intellectual space. The quiet to think. The freedom to learn. You are taught to read, sometimes to write. You copy psalms, annotate margins. If your convent has a scriptorium, you may come to know more Latin than any man in your village. You may copy Aristotle before your hands can milk a goat. Your sisters debate scripture, catalog herbs, keep accounts. The abbess may manage more wealth than the local lord. She may write letters to bishops and command deference from noblemen. Here, the veil is not a mark of erasure, it's a shield. A sanctified boundary. Of course, not all convents are equal. Some are poor, barely scraping together enough to feed the sisters. Others are wealthy, with vineyards and mills, built by royal patronage and protected by church law. The privileges you experience depend on geography, politics, fortune. But wherever you are, you learn early that power in the convent is both permitted and policed. You may speak, but not too loudly. You may write, but not everything. You may lead, but only within limits. Still, compared to the outside, it's something. There are stories, always stories, of women who push those limits. Hildegard, who hears voices and writes books. Claire, who defies the Pope to keep her sisters poor. Julian, who sees visions and dares to describe God with tenderness, not thunder. You may never meet them. But you know their names. They travel farther than your feet ever will. And so, within stone walls and candlelight, you begin to build a mind. You think about the nature of sin, of justice, of the stars. You learn to make ink. You tend to dying sisters. You sing. You weep. You laugh, too, though not as loudly as you once did. You notice how the world forgets nuns in stories but relies on them in practice, when the plague comes, when the nobles feud, when abandoned children need care. You hold those children. You write those letters. You bury those dead. You are not invisible. Just veiled. The veil protects, but it also isolates. There are nights when silence echoes. When you wonder what life outside would have brought. Marriage. Childbirth. Hunger. You hear news from the world in scraps, a merchant's tale, a bishop's visit. You learn that another war has begun. That a king has died. That your brother has married. That your father has passed. Sometimes, they don't even tell you. They assume you've moved on. You haven't. And yet you do not leave. Not because you cannot, but because you know this life, with all its hardship and repetition, is yours. No one touches you without permission. No one speaks for you in court. No one demands your obedience because of a ring. You answer to God. Or so the order says. But sometimes you suspect that even God would be surprised by how well you've navigated this system. The church does not always love its women. It needs them, of course. But need is not respect. Women are saints or sinners, virgins or temptresses, madonnas or witches. The nun tries to slip through these binaries, but often ends up tangled in both. Revered in theory, ignored in practice. Praised in death, doubted in life. Still, you endure. Because here, in this hidden world of scripture and soil, you have carved out a space no one expected you to keep. You have learned. You have taught. You have prayed. And in doing so, you have become something more than what they named you. You think of the young ones now, the novices, the girls with shaking hands and eyes full of questions. You see yourself in them. And you teach them what no sermon ever said. That holiness is not silence, that discipline is not absence, and that wisdom, once earned, belongs to no man. You place a hand on a shoulder. You pass a book across a table. You correct a chant with a whisper. You light a candle and do not pray for salvation. You pray for memory. Because long after your body is laid in the earth, and your name reduced to an initial in a register, the songs you taught will still be sung. The recipes you wrote will still be used. The margins you annotated may one day be read by someone who wonders who you were. And though they may not know your face, they will know your mind. That is power. Quiet. Persistent. Sacred. And it was yours all along. And if you live long enough to become the oldest among them, the one whose back bends but whose voice remains steady, then your wisdom becomes the pillar others lean on. The younger sisters come to you not for orders, but for understanding. They ask how you survived the long winters. How you reconcile doubt and faith. How you manage to stay human in a system that forgets it's built by humans. And you answer, not with commandments, but with stories. You tell them about the time you broke silence to sing a forbidden tune. About the letter you wrote that reached a dying sister's brother in time. About the book you saved from fire. You tell them how you buried 3 abbesses and carried on, even when it felt like the walls themselves were grieving. You show them that resistance can wear the face of gentleness. That strength can exist in folding linens and mending shoes. That rebellion sometimes looks like saying grace with open eyes. And when you die, the candle burned for you will be just one of many. But your absence will echo through the hallways like a bell, gentle, constant, unforgettable. And somewhere, a girl will read your notes in the margin of a psalter and wonder what kind of woman lived in that hand. That wonder will be your legacy. That echo, your immortality. Because even here, behind stone and silence, you changed the world in the only way the world ever truly changes, one life, lived fully, with purpose. You're not young anymore, though you can't quite remember when the change occurred. There was no single moment, no specific birthday or falling leaf that whispered, "Now, you are old." It came gradually, like fog seeping into the corners of a field, gentle and unstoppable. You first noticed it in how the butcher began calling you "mother" instead of your name. Then the blacksmith's wife no longer asked you to come dancing in the square during feast days. And one day, you caught your reflection in the basin, hair streaked with gray, skin lined from wind and work, and you realized the world had already decided, you were no longer a girl. Not a bride. Not a bearer of children. Just an old woman. Invisible, unless needed. And yet, despite the creeping aches in your joints and the way your breath shortens when the weather shifts, you're still here. Still waking with the birds. Still tending the hearth. Still offering advice when the young ones think to ask for it. And sometimes even when they don't. You're still needed, though the needing is quieter now. More subtle. Less urgent. You are no longer the center of the family wheel, but you are still its spoke. Holding things steady. Remembering what came before. And lately, you've been thinking more about that. About memory. About what stays, and what fades. You've lived a full life, full of labor, of sacrifice, of small joys and greater silences. You've seen babies born and elders buried. You've washed wounds that healed and wounds that didn't. You've spoken truths that no one recorded, and held secrets that would shame men if ever written down. And through it all, you've wondered, when you are gone, who will remember you? Your name isn't in the manor rolls. It wasn't entered in the merchant's accounts. It's not carved in any church ledger or sewn into any noble banner. You have no seal, no property deed, no letter with your signature. There is no official record that you walked this earth, that you prayed every night for your children, that you gathered wild garlic from the riverbanks in spring, or that you once held your husband's hand so tightly during a storm that he laughed and told you not to crush his bones. And yet those things happened. They are real. You were real. Aren't you? You think of your mother. She is gone now, buried beneath the old rowan tree near the chapel. You visit her sometimes, though there's no stone to mark her place. Just a patch of moss that grows thick in the spring, and the way the air seems stiller when you stand there. You remember the way she braided your hair before feast days, the songs she hummed that no one else seems to remember, the way she made cider taste sweeter by whispering a blessing over the apples. No one but you remembers these things. And when you go, those memories go too. Lost. Like breath in winter. And still, you live. You bake bread. You sort beans. You say the right words when the young widow down the lane loses her baby. You teach your granddaughter how to recognize good wool from poor, how to mend a hem with pride, how to say, no, without saying it out loud. These are not great deeds, not the kind of things scribes will ink onto parchment. But they are everything. They are the glue between generations. The thread between centuries. You know now that legacy for women like you is not about monuments. It is not a statue in the town square or a family crest above a fireplace. It is the recipe passed from hand to hand, adjusted for what's in season. It's the lullabies sung in the same rhythm every night until the child sleeps. It's the way you touched a frightened girl's back and told her she'd be fine, even when you weren't sure she would. It's the invisible things. The essential things. And yet, it hurts sometimes. To know that the steward who counted grain will be remembered in ledgers long after his grain has spoiled, but your name will fade with the next rain. The priest who visited once a month and mumbled half his sermons will be listed in church records, but the prayers you whispered in the dark, prayers with teeth and tears and hope, are gone the moment they leave your lips. The boys who threw rocks at chickens will inherit land. The girl who cleaned the chicken coop and kept the flock fed will be forgotten. Historians still debate whether women left any mark at all in medieval records. Some say that the church kept notes on saintly women, noble women, notorious women. Others insist that even then, most women's names appear only in relation to men, as wives, daughters, witnesses to other people's stories. You've read none of these books, of course, but you've lived the truth of them. You know that for every famous abbess or clever midwife recorded in ink, there were thousands like you. Women who remembered harvest dates by the shape of the moon, who buried children without a priest, who saved entire households with vinegar, wool, and stubbornness, and who died with no mention in history. Still, you do not weep. Not often, anyway. Because you have something they don't. You have the knowledge that you mattered. You changed things. Maybe not kingdoms, maybe not laws, but lives. You softened your husband's anger after a hard day. You taught your son how to speak gently. You taught your daughter how to survive, even if it meant staying silent. And now, you see echoes of yourself in the younger women. You watch your niece argue with the reeve in a tone she never would have dared a year ago. You watch the washerwoman's daughter walk alone to the spring and carry back a bucket twice her size with her chin high. You see them learning the quiet power you once thought invisible. And it occurs to you that perhaps invisibility is not the same as absence. Perhaps the most important things are meant to be unrecorded, because they don't belong to time or parchment. They belong to the rhythm of breath, to the hush before dawn, to the way a mother's touch lingers on the back of a child's neck long after the child is grown. You will die. That is certain. And when you do, there will be no fanfare. The gravedigger will do his job. The priest will mutter his words. Someone will cry. Someone will forget. But something will remain. A way of being. A way of enduring. A way of making life out of what the world insists should have been silence. You don't know who will remember you. But you hope it's enough that someone, years from now, perhaps centuries, will hum your song without knowing where it came from. That someone will harvest herbs the way you did, or whisper blessings over bread before breaking it. That a girl who feels unseen will suddenly feel less alone because something in her bones remembers the strength of women who came before. Because that is how women have always survived. Not through glory. Through memory. And memory does not ask permission. It lives. It passes. It endures. And now, so do you.